Hi everybody, today we are going to be speaking about the second relational paradigm in the set of paradigms that we're speaking about in language acquisition. Why look at paradigms? Because they reveal the parts of language, the components of language that develop in children and that comprise the behavior that children and I am doing right now. I'm speaking, right? And language is a complex, very complex behavioral system with many parts. And there are a number of points of view about language that reveal the components of language and how they develop in children. One of these points of view, the second relational point of view, is that of Noam Chomsky. And as I hope you have heard of that name. He's quite infamous and iconic, and certainly has revealed a great deal of knowledge to the world about what the nature of language really is. This is the second relational paradigm. Last week we spoke about the Bloom and Leahy paradigm, and we'll be speaking more about Bloom and Leahy subsequently. But today, let's take a look at Chomsky's work and what Chomsky has to teach us about language. What is language according to Chomsky? And I'm afraid my picture is blocking a little part of the top of this this PowerPoint. But let me say that according to Chomsky, language is a relationship-making property of the mind. A relationship-making property of the mind. It's what the mind does to both produce and comprehend the language. It is analogous to cognition, which we all think about as a function of the mind. Cognition, becoming aware of things and problem solving, etc., learning, etc., using our mind. Well, language is an analogous and quite closely related property of the mind. According to Chomsky, language serves as a tool of thought. It functions to express and comprehend awareness and meaning. Notice express and comprehend. Both language production and comprehension, receptive and expressive language, are both really part of one single unitary relationship-making property of the mind. This relationship-making property of the mind, that is language according to Chomsky, functions to express and comprehend awareness and meaning. It acts exclusively on mental representations, not real-world objects. Now that we spoke about last week when we spoke about ideas being the fact that when we speak, language is a code, according to Bloom, for representing ideas about the world. Not the real world, but ideas about the world. And that means that whenever children, as we spoke last week, when we or children speak about things like as concrete as a table, a floor, or a wall, they are really talking about how they're thinking about these things out there that are presumably out there in the world. When we use language, we're referring to things that are mental representations of the world in our mind using a code that is comprised, if you remember last week, we listed all the components of language. Many of these linguistic objects, we'll list them again today. Things like phonology, morphology, syntax, etc. The lexicon. It's all in our mind. Language is exclusively a function of the mind that acts on mental representations, i.e. linguistic objects. This property of the mind creates relationships among linguistic objects that express relational meaning. Now, what we mean by relational meaning is something we are going to be developing an understanding of, hopefully, as we go along this term. And really over the next few weeks, we'll be very much focusing on semantic relations and content categories that reflect relational meaning. Even later today, we will at least approach this meaning here. of the concept relational meaning. According to Chomsky, language comprehends meaning by analyzing structural relationships among linguistic objects. That is, comprehension involves analyzing relationships. We'll look at that very shortly. And linguistic relationships that we're taught, the linguistic relationships that Chomsky has spoken about and that we're speaking about have universal characteristics. What does that mean? It means that if we view language as a property of the human mind, then all humans, everybody who belongs to this particular species, which really are all the speakers in the world, well, we all have a human mind. Therefore, these linguistic relationship-making property of the mind is shared by everybody, all speakers. And it doesn't matter what language individuals are speaking. By speaking and listening and comprehending speaking and comprehending language, individuals are applying this relationship-making property. And therefore, all languages in the world, all languages will have embodied in them, in the content, form, and use of all languages in the world, Russian, English, Italian, Spanish, Fulani, Asian languages, Mandarin, Cantonese, etc. All languages and dialects reflect the same relationship-making properties, even though, unless you're bilingual or multilingual and have had experiences with other languages, you can't understand or produce the other languages, even though they share the very same relationship-making properties as one's own language. Very weird. We'll take a look at this. Now, you know what I would like to do? I'm going to pause for a moment here, and you're going to, hopefully I'll edit this together in a way that the pause, you won't even notice the pause. But I am going to show you Chomsky himself and a few minutes of a lecture that he did that I think reflects what I'm trying to get across here. So let's try to take a look at this. You'll see at the bottom, by the way, of this particular slide, the web address. So if you have problems seeing my presentation of this to you, you can look at the entire lecture or the piece of the lecture 2340 to 3217 that we're about to look at together. Okay, let's pause for a moment here as I do the switch.
Journal of the American Academy, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. There's an issue a week or two ago, which is a very enthusiastic review of a recent conference on evolution of language, talking about how much progress there's been and so on. And if you read through it, and you read through the papers of the conference, you notice that none of them have anything to do with language. I mean, they're all studies of, interesting, amusing data about what chimpanzees do and what dolphins do and so on and so forth. But there isn't the slightest reason to believe that any of that has anything whatsoever to do with language. There's no connection. And this is overlooked because for a number of reasons. One reason is that there's a kind of a pop Darwinism, sort of a superficial version of Darwinism, which is not biology, but is very commonly held, even unfortunately by some biologists, which hold that everything has to happen in small changes. There have to be small changes. Anything that exists has to come from a long series of small adaptations, each of which is a little different than the one before it, and they're all directed by natural selection. Well, any serious evolutionary biologist will tell you that's perfect nonsense. I mean, that's not the way evolution works. And it's understood that it's not the way it works. But that's a kind of a popular conception. And therefore, human language, following this, must arise from small steps from animal communication. There isn't any reason to believe that. In fact, there isn't even any reason to believe that human language is a communication system. In fact, there's strong reason to disbelieve it, come back to it. But that's kind of like an a priori assumption. And it leads to some very curious results. I mean, language is a system of infinite generation. That's not questionable. And you cannot go from finite to infinite in small steps. So there's no point trying. Can't be done. You can't go from a system of maybe, say, 4-word sentences to unbounded sentences in small steps. So you have to give it up. I mean, you can't approach the question that way. Another odd property of these investigations is that they do not ask what language is. What are you trying to show? What is it that evolved? It's just, well, language is used by people to talk to each other, so we'll go on from there. It's kind of like studying the evolution of the eye, when all you know about eyes is that people use them to watch television. So, okay, now let's talk about the evolution of the eye. It really is at that level. It's a highly irrational subject, and in fact, the general discussion of language is itself highly irrational. In many respects, we can go into that, but it's true. In any event, if you're serious about it, there is going to be a problem of how did language evolve someday, and you're going to have to know what it is, otherwise you can't. To the extent that you know what it is, you can ask how it evolved. And one thing that it is a system of digital infinity, hence a generative procedure, recursive procedure, and we're going to have to account for how that developed and how it works. I'll come back to that in a moment. There's a traditional conception of language, goes back to Aristotle, which is a common sense conception, and that is Aristotle's formula is language is sound with a meaning. Okay, it's sort of right. Now that was considered sufficient for 2,000 years, 2,500 years. If you look at the history of the study of language, which is quite rich and complex, it almost entirely is concerned with the sound part. Sound in a broad sense. That includes phonology, morphology, all the ways of organizing the externalization of language, ultimately through the sensory motor system. And that's richly investigated. And it's almost the entire study of language. There's some study of meaning, or what's thought to be meaning, but it's missing something critical. The study of sound is really syntax. It's the study of symbolic manipulations inside the head until you get to the point where you attach the study to the sensory motor system. Well, that's acoustic and articulatory phonetics. That translates the phonological syntax, the morphological syntax, to actual articulatory motions, for example. Now, on the meaning side, if you want to really study semantics, there's a lot of extremely interesting work in formal semantics, which is kind of like phonology. It's talking about the parts of syntax that are oriented towards ultimate interpretation at the thought interface. But it still isn't semantics, and it won't be until it relates that to something that's mind external, just as phonology goes beyond syntax when it relates the topic to, say, articulatory motions or perceptual operations. Well, how do you relate semantics, what's called semantics, to something mind external? It's done by a dogma. The dogma is called referentialism, the belief that the elementary units of meaning, say roughly words, are related to extra-mental objects by a one-to-one relation. So the symbolic entity cow is related to that thing over there, which you get milk from, and so on. Now, actually, animal communication works like that. As far as anyone knows, all animal communication systems do have a referential relation between symbols and extramental entities, and you can identify them. However, if you look at human language, it isn't like that at all. There's no relation between the symbols, the words, and anything that a physicist can identify. I won't go into it, but if you begin to investigate them, you find that that's ubiquitous. There just isn't any such relationship, which means that there isn't any study of real semantics. There are books, classic books, with titles like Word and Object, or Word and Thing, and so on. But they're based on the referentialist myth. And if you allow yourself to be puzzled and you say, well, what is the connection? You see, it just doesn't work. Now that raises a huge poverty of stimulus problem. How do children find out the meanings of the words, since they aren't related to extramental entities, as you find as soon as you begin to look closely? That also raises a problem about evolution. How did it ever come about? The problem about evolution is too remote even to pose. The problem about acquisition could be posed, but not until you recognize the problem. So that's a topic yet to be investigated, because the problem hasn't been understood. We haven't allowed ourselves to be puzzled about the relation between, say, the word river and the Seine and so on. And when you begin to allow yourself to be puzzled about it, you find that it's quite obscure. Well, that's two of the parts of the Aristotelian slogan, sound and meaning. One aspect of it that has barely been investigated up till the 1950s is the with part. It's sound with meaning. How are they connected? Well, there was an answer to that, more or less like the objects find their natural place. The answer is it's done by analogy. So it was understood that people produce new sentences. Well, it's by analogy with the old ones. That sounds like an answer, until you ask yourself, what's analogy? And then it all falls apart. There's nothing you can say about analogy. Well, again, if you allow yourself to be puzzled, the science can begin, the inquiry can begin. You can say, well, okay, how does it work? Well, back in the 1950s, as soon as this willingness to be puzzled entered consciousness, immediately it turned out that almost nothing was understood. It had been assumed at that time that just about everything was understood. There were no real problems. You just applied the methods of structural linguistics and the procedures and so on. You got all the answers. If you want to talk about language acquisition, conditioning, reinforcement, have all the answers. Turned out as soon as people started looking at it, it wasn't that everything was understood. It was that nothing was understood. Everything you looked at was a puzzle, even the simplest things. And some of those puzzles, incidentally, remain. Well, some of them have yet to be recognized as puzzles. Talk about one. One of the earliest examples that was given, that there were a host of them, but there's one that kind of took on a life of its own. It's a very simple example.
Okay, everybody. Move myself down a little bit. Okay, everybody. We're back again. I hope you enjoyed the Chomsky excerpt. He had some interesting and controversial things to say. He raised questions about language as that communication is a major function of language. That's quite controversial. I think what he had to say, which he takes, I think he takes issue with the idea that language is primarily for communication. He takes issue with Lois Bloom's definition of language, that language is a code whereby ideas about the world are represented, that for communication. He puts language rather than being a code. He redefines language as mind function. He talks about language as being about and involving entirely linguistic objects, including ideas. He says that when a child talks about a river, or any of us talk about a river, we think referential linguistics suggests that. Referential semantics suggests that we're talking about something that's really out there, that we're referring to the outside world. But Chomsky's position is the position I have articulated, I believe, that whatever we're speaking about, it's something in our mind, and we're using linguistic objects to speak about it. He talks about language as being generative and, in fact, involving digital infinity. I love that term, digital infinity. We'll come to that in a moment. We'll talk about what that might really mean. I'm going to have a t-shirt made with digital infinity right on it. I can't wait. I'm trying to find somebody who will help me do that. So let's continue on here, though, and another thing that Chomsky made a point of is that whatever that linguistic property of the mind is, it applies both to language production and comprehension. And here's something to think about. Look at this sentence here. Instinctively, eagles that fly swim. I'm asking you, what word does instinctively go with? Fly or swim? Instinctively, I'm sure you all said that you recognize that instinctively is an adverb that modifies swim, not fly. Why do you know when you read or hear this sentence that the adverb instinctively modifies swim and not fly? Why do you know that? Now, you certainly don't know that through experience, because you're well aware that eagles fly instinctively. In fact, the verb fly is closer to instinctively than the verb that instinctively modifies, which is swim. And your mind put it right onto swim, didn't it? Why? How's that possible? If linear order had anything to do with it, and you attached instinctively to the closest verb, assuming you recognize it goes with a verb, you'd put it onto fly, wouldn't you? Instinctively, you would say your mind would recognize that you could transform that sentence back into something like eagles that fly instinctively swim. But you didn't do that, did you? No. You recognized that your mind related instinctively to the last word, the furthest verb away from the term instinctively, and the thing that your experience knows the eagles can't do. Eagles can't swim, or at least most eagles. Eagles that fly swim instinctively. That's nonsense. Based on experience, it doesn't make sense that you would do that. You would attach instinctively to swim based on word order. Should be closer verb is fly. So why does your mind put instinctively onto swim? The answer is, of course, that the mind computes, and I'll use that term, and we're going to look at it in more detail a little later on, figures out, makes a decision, does an analysis of the sentence. Of course, you're not conscious of this, and breaks the sentence into phrases, and recognizes that the noun phrase subject of this sentence, the full subject of this sentence is what? It's eagles that fly. And subjects must be noun phrases. Only nouns can be subjects. And the head of that phrase is eagles. That is the main noun. That is the bottom line subject of the sentence. although the full noun phrase subject is eagles that fly. So instinctively goes with the verb phrase predicate of the sentence. Eagles that fly is the subject of the verb swim. And your mind knows that. And swim is the head of the verb phrase predicate. You know, in school, in high school, right? You had experience breaking sentences into subjects and predicates. Well, if we broke the sentence into subject and predicate, we would say eagles that fly is the subject, swim is the predicate, instinctively goes with swim. Why? Our brain knows that. Our brain does that analysis. The analysis that you do consciously, your mind does instinctively. Well, maybe not instinctively, but structurally. It does a structural analysis and puts instinctively, it overrides, this structural analysis overrides experience, your knowledge about eagles. The structural analysis, it overrides linear position of words. In fact, instinctively, the sentence could have read initially, eagles that fly swim instinctively. That's how you rearranged it. And instinctively has a comma notice when it's written. And it really was moved from, I should have a pointer on this slide here that I could play with. It was moved from, in your mind, from after the word swim to before the word eagle. But likely your mind left a copy of that word, or that instinctively at the beginning is a copy, and it just, or at least it left a trace, and that instinctively goes right back to where it started from, after swim, in English, of course. Think about this. It makes absolutely no sense, based on experience or word order, that you would put instinctively after swim. You would relate instinctively to the word swim. But structurally, in terms of relationship-making property of the mind, the mind analyzes the sentences as a noun phrase subject, eagles that fly, a verb phrase predicate, swim, recognizes instinctively as belonging to the verb phrase predicate and moves it over there. That fly, by the way, is a relative clause that is the complement of the noun phrase eagles that fly. It tells you about eagles. We will be looking at this in some depth next time, actually, during our next meeting, as we and probably when I see you in person, we will spend some time trying to understand and analyze syntax. This is evidence that Chomsky is onto something when he says language is a relationship-making property of the mind that applies both to language production and comprehension, because it's the relationship-making property, the analysis of relationships in this sentence, structural relationships, phrase structural relationships, that lead you to understand this. And by the way, that develop in children, this is what develops in child language acquisition, this relationship-making ability, and which could be damaged in cases of language disorders that we treat. And this is, I think, what Chomsky, I believe I know, this relationship-making property of the mind is what Chomsky is saying has been overlooked in the studies of language, and certainly in operant studies. By the way, on that videotape that we saw, I started out with Chomsky's comments on evolution of language and his disagreement that it comes from animal language, and his disagreement with Darwin that evolution involves small steps by small steps. That position on evolution has pretty much been rejected, because evolution, like child development, or child development, like evolution, involves stage development, and that means a major and rapid shift when the mind reorganizes, makes new relationships, is capable of new relationship making. We will think about that. That applies to this course. We'll come to that. Okay, let's move ahead here then. Some of the terms that we've used so far and that appeared in the Chomsky lecture, I believe. Universal, that term universal applies to the idea intrinsic to all languages. Relational means mental and physical relationship making. And generative is the basis for the individual's ability to spontaneously create and comprehend an infinite quantity of utterances across multiple contexts. Basis for the individual's ability to spontaneously create and comprehend an infinite quantity, that is, number of utterances across multiple contexts. Everybody. Language is what I'm doing. I am just rambling on here. I've talked about this many times in the past. I'm talking about it again now. The sentences that I am creating are similar to past sentences I created to talk about this and other things, but they are they're likely slightly different, because I can keep creating sentences, and all my many sentences that I create share characteristics one with the other. And I create these sentences when I lecture. I create sentences with subjects, verbs, and complements when I talk to my kids, when I talk to friends, blah, blah, blah. I keep creating sentences. In fact, my language allows me to create an infinite number of sentences, embodying a finite set of relationship-making properties that we call rules. By the way, of which we're not conscious. We're not aware of the rules we apply to generate sentences. The only thing we're really aware of as we speak, unless you're a linguist or a speech-language pathologist, the only thing you're aware of is your ideas. Of course, and even that we're all a little confused about, because we think we're really talking about the world out there, but we're talking about the world up here. Still, the ideas is what we're aware of. This other stuff we're not, and we can keep generating sentences. Thus, digital infinity. Infinity means never-ending, uncountable, forever. And we can speak forever, and in fact, any sentence can be forever long. We'll speak about that as we go along here. Forever long. That's weird that we have in our mind the ability, we have infinity in our own minds. What are relations intrinsic to language, content, form, and use? These we'll be looking at over the next over this course, although the first set of relations you'll be looking at in the course on phonology, not on this course on language acquisition, because we don't have the time. Phonology involves relationship making. Remember, phonology is the sound system of the language. Features of phonology, features of sounds, such as voicing, alveolar plus or minus anterior or anterior-posterior, coronal. Those features, they merged. Combined. The word merge means combined or relate. That's another word for relate. It's a Chomsky term. Merge to create onsets and rhymes. That is, initial consonants, vowels, and final consonants in units, which merge to create syllables, a natural unit of phonology, which merge, that is, relate to create prosodic stress units, which merge to create, it's under my picture, it says words, morphemes. Whoops, I messed this up now. Somebody by the name of Helene Marshall, who should be sitting in on this, who is my consultant on this, my recorded lectures. I should have set this PowerPoint thing up differently, but I haven't figured it out yet. So Syllables merge to create prosodic stress units, which merge to create morphemes, which merge to create words, which are the building blocks of sentences and the basic unit of sound of children that children are trying to generate, right? Words to sentences, etc. Lexical relations, that is, relations within morphemes and vocabulary. The specific instance of, and in any word stands for a specific instance of an idea or construct, and at the same time its category. So if I say this is a pair, this is scissors. This is a scissors. Should say a pair of scissors, right? I'm trying to keep it simple. This is scissors. Well, this is a particular one, and it belongs to the category scissors. That is, this is scissors, and I don't have any other versions of scissors here. But once a child has the word scissors, they have attached to it. It becomes a category, and it's an example of many, different little scissors, big scissors, anything that has this kind of feature set is recognized as scissors. Dog. This is a dog. I think we discussed that last week. The sentence, this is a dog. The word dog refers to a specific instance of dog, like Ping Pong, who's standing outside here, and my dog. And the category, dog is a category, right? There are collies of dogs and Dachshund dogs and Peekapom dogs, etc., etc. Sentence-based relationships. Semantic relations, which we'll be looking at again next time around. Object relation content categories, event relation content categories, syntactic relations between merged phrases, between heads and complements within phrases. These are entities we can look forward to studying over the next the course of this term. What are implications of Chomsky's conceptualization of language? Relations intrinsic to content, form, and use account for generativity of language production and comprehension. Developmental taxonomies describe the nature and sequence of development of these relational components of language in children. That is, and we will be looking at the Bloom and Leahy developmental taxonomy and others as we proceed across this course on child language acquisition. And reception and expression are both properties of one relationship making property of the mind. And we'll be looking at the following important relational measures in the course of this term. Piagetian cognition, with these stages, the sensory motor, pre-operational, and operational stages. I'm sure you've all have some familiarity with Piaget's stages. We have Bloom and Leahy's content form taxonomy, or content form use taxonomy, and we will be looking at that in depth as we proceed across this course. We'll be looking at pretend play and two taxonomies, Westby and Nikolich's play scales, and we will see that pretend play is relational in nature. So we have all this to look forward to. And again, this is another videotape. I think this is a videotape I showed you. I'd suggest you look at that a few times. The video itself at that website, at that URL, goes, I think it's over an hour. But the clip that I presented to you was around 23:40, that is 23 minutes and 40 seconds in, to 32 minutes, 17 seconds in. We will continue with our discussion. The primary takeaway from this particular lecture, I hope you see, is that relationship making property of the mind is what language is, according to Chomsky, and the development of linguistic objects, and the relationships that account for the relationship making that accounts for generativity, that is ongoing, infinite, the ability to express or comprehend an infinite number of utterances, is what one of the most important things that develop in children as they acquire language, and which we need to really try to understand as speech-language pathologists, because we'll be addressing these relationship-making properties in children with language disorders, who are going to will likely have difficulty with these relationship-making properties, and we are going to be targeting these properties in our interventions. So we will need to be spending some time figuring out what these things are and how they develop. And that's where we're headed. Thank you. See you later.